The most famous, ostensibly wisest king in biblical history, the man who literally built God's ultimate temple, ended his life, constructing altars to foreign gods right across the valley from it.
Yeah, it's wild.
Just picture that for a second. You have, the priests of Yahweh opening the eastern doors of the magnificent temple every single morning, and they look directly across the Kidron Valley to see altars burning sacrifices to Chemosh and Molech. Altars built by their own king.
Right. It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It is. How does the wisest man in the world lose his mind so completely? So today we are diving into the golden, bloody, and ultimately tragic reign of King Solomon, which is found in the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings.
Exactly.
And for those of you listening, we are picking up right where we left off last time, transitioning out of the long, broken arc of David's later years and into an era that represents the absolute peak of the United Monarchy, right before it shatters completely. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, it really is a stunning reversal when you look at the entirety of these 11 chapters.
Right.
I mean, if you stand back far enough, you're looking at a deeply compressed tragedy.
Right.
It begins with this young man
Yeah.
chosen by God, gifted with unprecedented moral discernment, constructing, the most theologically profound structure in Israelite history.
Yeah, the temple.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it ends with the exact same man, cynical and compromised in his old age, setting the stage for a civil war that will basically tear the nation apart the moment he stops breathing.
Yeah.
It's a masterclass in how slow daily attrition destroys a legacy.
And to really grasp how we get to that tragic fracture, we have to start with the man who left the kingdom to him.
David.
Yes, David. The opening of 1 Kings gives us one of the most disquieting, visceral scenes in the entire Hebrew Bible. I mean, we're looking at David. This is the man who killed a giant as a teenager, who danced wildly before the Ark of the Covenant, who held a fragile, volatile empire together through 2 decades of relentless warfare. And now he is shivering in a bed. He's cold. His servants pile blankets on him, but he cannot get warm.
That detail about the cold is so crucial. His servants are desperate, right?
Yeah.
So they bring him a young woman, Abishag the Shunammite, to lie beside him, essentially as a human water bottle, to provide physical warmth.
Wow, yeah.
The text makes a point of noting her beauty, but then it explicitly states a very important detail. The king knew her not. He had no intimate relations with her.
Which, immediately raises a question for you as a reader. Is David's inability to get warm merely a clinical medical description of a dying geriatric man? Or is the text trying to tell us something deeper?
Right. What's the subtext?
Exactly. Because to me, it feels like a glaring symbolic indicator that his royal vitality has completely vanished. The mandate, the literal heat of his kingship has fully dissipated. He's a ghost haunting his own palace. The king is essentially dead before his heart has actually stopped beating.
You're exactly right to read it that way. In ancient Near Eastern royal ideology, the loss of virility, the loss of bodily warmth and physical capability is synonymous with the loss of the right to rule.
Wow. So it's a political crisis, not just a medical one.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
A king who cannot generate heat is a king who cannot project power. And because nature, and especially court politics, abhors a vacuum, the political machinery in Jerusalem starts moving at a breakneck pace the second David's weakness becomes public knowledge.
Which brings us to Adonijah. With his older brothers Amnon and Absalom dead, Adonijah is David's eldest surviving son.
Right.
By birth order, he is the heir apparent. And he knows his father is fading, so he begins positioning himself. He starts acquiring chariots and horsemen and an entourage of 50 men to run before him. It's a massive display of military and political strength.
Very public, too.
Yes. Then he throws a lavish feast at the Spring of Rogel just outside the walls of Jerusalem.
And if you want to understand the political factions in ancient Jerusalem, you don't need a voting record. You just need to look at the guest list for that feast.
No, absolutely.
Adonijah invites Joab, the old battle-hardened commander of David's army. He invites Abiathar, the loyal priest who survived the slaughter at Nob years ago. These are heady hitters.
Yeah, the old guard.
Exactly. But the negative space, who is deliberately left out, speaks volumes. Nathan the prophet is conspicuously absent. Benaiah, the commander of David's elite personal mercenary guard, is absent. And of course, his younger brother Solomon is nowhere to be found.
It is a highly calculated preemptive coronation disguised as a religious festival. Adonijah is trying to create a fait accompli.
Yes.
Like, if all the elites are eating his food and praising his name, the transition of power becomes inevitable.
But he underestimates Nathan and Bathsheba. What follows is court intrigue operating at its absolute highest level. Nathan, sensing the kingdom is literally slipping away while they sit there, engineers a masterfully coordinated scene.
He sends Bathsheba in first, right?
Right. He sends Bathsheba into David's bedchamber first. She approaches the shivering king and reminds him of an oath that her son Solomon would sit on the throne.
Wait, let me stop you there because that detail always jumps out at me. She reminds David of an oath, but we, the readers, have absolutely no prior record of David ever making this promise.
Nope, none.
I mean, we've read 1 into Samuel, we follow the whole story. Nowhere did David swear Solomon would be king. So, is she making this up? Is this pure political manipulation of a dying man whose memory is failing?
That is the brilliance of the narrative. It refuses to tell you. It leaves the ambiguity perfectly intact.
That's so
It
fascinating.
really is. Maybe David made a private promise years ago that wasn't recorded. Or maybe Bathsheba is capitalizing on his frailty to secure her son's survival. Because if Adonijah takes the throne, she and Solomon are as good as dead.
Right, in ancient courts, you don't let rivals live.
Exactly. Regardless of the truth, the trap is sprung. Right as Bathsheba is finishing her plea, Nathan walks in, exactly on cue, confirming her story and amplifying the existential threat of Adonijah's rogue feast.
The psychological pressure on David in that moment must have been immense. He manages to rouse himself from this shivering stupor long enough to give a definitive order. He tells them to take his own royal mule, a massive symbol of kingship, and have Solomon ride it down to the Gihon spring.
Notice the geography here. It is a tale of two springs. Adonijah is feasting at the spring of Rogel to the south. Solomon is paraded down to the Gihon spring on the eastern slope of the city of David.
Which is really important.
Oh, very. Gihon is the primary water source for Jerusalem. It's the lifeblood of the city. Benaiah and the Zadokite priests anoint Solomon there. And the text notes that the crowd's reaction, the blowing of the ram's horn and the shouting, is so deafening that the earth literally splits with the sound.
I love visualizing the sheer cinematic panic of what happens next. Down at Rogel, Adonijah and his guests have just finished eating. They're probably feeling incredibly confident.
Celebrating, yeah.
And then they hear this seismic rumble echoing down the valley. Jonathan, the son of Abiathar the priest, comes running in with the news. David has made Solomon king. Solomon is sitting on the throne.
It's over in an instant.
And instantly, the illusion of Adonijah's power evaporates. The feast dissolves into absolute terror. Everyone scatters to save their own lives. Adonijah himself runs and grabs the horns of the altar for sanctuary.
Which transitions us from the adrenaline of the succession crisis into the cold, calculated reality of chapter 2. Solomon grants Adonijah a conditional pardon. But what follows over the next few pages is the systematic, chilling elimination of every rival center of influence.
It's brutal.
It is a brutal consolidation of power.
It's basically a biblical mafia movie. Let's look at how he handles Adonijah first. Sometime later, Adonijah goes to Bathsheba, the queen mother, with a seemingly innocent request. He asks her to petition Solomon to let him marry Abishag the Shunammite, the beautiful young woman who kept David warm.
Right.
Bathsheba takes the request to Solomon, and Solomon absolutely explodes. He says, "Why do you ask for Abishag, for Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also." He immediately orders Adonijah's execution.
To understand the mechanics of Solomon's rage here, you have to understand ancient Near Eastern royal property. A king's harem was political capital. It belonged exclusively to the throne.
It wasn't just about romance.
Not at all. Taking a former king's concubine wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a public declaration of kingship. Remember, Absalom did exactly this during his rebellion when he pitched a tent on the roof and slept with David's concubines in 2 Samuel.
Oh, right. I totally forgot about that.
Yeah, so when Adonijah asks for Abishag, Solomon recognizes the political mechanism instantly.
But I've always wondered, was Adonijah actually playing 3D chess here? Was he making a calculated, slow-burn claim to the throne? Or was he just a defeated, lonely man who found Abishag genuinely attractive and thought it was a harmless consolation prize?
Again, the text forces you to hold the moral complexity. We don't get access to Adonijah's internal monologue.
Yeah.
We only get Solomon's interpretation of his actions.
Yes.
And Solomon's interpretation is lethal.
And the lethal pragmatism doesn't stop there. Next is Joab. Joab knows he backed the wrong horse with Adonijah, and he knows his time is up. He runs to the tabernacle and grasps the horns of the altar, claiming ancient sanctuary.
The ultimate desperation move.
Exactly. But Solomon orders Benaiah to strike him down right there at the altar. Benaiah hesitates, but Solomon insists. The justification given is that Joab has unpaid blood debts. He murdered Abner and Amasa in cold blood years ago.
Right.
But wait, I have to push back here. Isn't shedding blood at the sacred altar a massive sacrilege? How does a supposedly righteous king justify violating the deepest religious sanctuary laws?
It is a massive sacrilege. And that tension is entirely the point. The scholar Walter Brueggemann has written extensively on this. He sees this text as a raw, unflinching portrait of how power actually operates.
Just naked power.
Exactly. It works pragmatically, it works violently, and it often operates entirely outside the covenant norms that are supposed to govern Israel. The narrator doesn't step in to say, and God was pleased with this. The narrator just presents the ruthless efficiency of it.
Wow.
Yeah, Solomon uses a legal loophole. Exodus 21 says a premeditated murderer can be taken even from God's altar to die. But the motive is clearly political survival wrapped in a veneer of ancient justice.
It's the ultimate political spin, and he keeps going. Abiathar, the priest who carried the ark for David when he was fleeing for his life, is stripped of his priesthood and banished to his ancestral village of Anathoth.
Right.
Shimei, the man who threw rocks and cursed David years ago, is put under strict house arrest. When Shimei leaves the city 3 years later to chase down some runaway slaves, violating the terms of his parole, Solomon has him executed too.
By the end of chapter 2, the narrator gives us this chillingly brief summary statement. So the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon.
It's breathtakingly cynical. We have scholars like Leonard Rost who view chapters 1 and 2 as brilliant Solomonic propaganda.
Oh, definitely.
Ross argued that the whole point of this narrative is to systematically disqualify every single rival to the throne so that Solomon looks like the only viable option. Amnon disqualified himself by assault, Absalom by treason, Adonijah by asking for the concubine.
Right.
In this reading, Solomon keeps his hands perfectly clean. He's just the reluctant administrator of justice.
Yes, but P. Callum McCarter offers a different lens. He reads it less as moralizing propaganda and more as a diplomatic cable.
Like a State Department memo.
Exactly. It's an apologetic document meant to explain to foreign powers and domestic elites exactly why all these famous men are suddenly dead. It's essentially saying, yes, the new king just executed the commander of the army and the high priest, but here are the legal, precedent-based reasons why he had to do it. It's an ancient press release managing a public relations nightmare.
Which brings up such a profound question about how the Bible presents history. We have the blood and absolute ruthlessness of chapter 2 juxtaposed immediately with the divine, intimate encounter in chapter 3, where God appears to Solomon in a dream.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast.
It really is. The king who just murdered his brother and his father's general goes to sleep and has a conversation with the creator of the universe. The editors of this text are deeply comfortable with that tension. It suggests that God works through history exactly as it is, messy, violent, politically compromised, and his purposes move forward regardless of human frailty.
To really understand how those editors were shaping this story, we need to pull back the curtain on the scholarly framing of 1 Kings. How did this text actually come together? Because it wasn't written by a single guy sitting in a room taking dictation.
Exactly. Scholars generally agree that we are looking at a composite document. You have at least 3 distinct layers of material interwoven here. First, you have the remnants of the succession narrative, which is the raw political drama of chapters 1 and 2 that we just discussed.
Right.
Second, you have genuine archival material. When you read chapter 4 and see these long, dry lists of administrative officials, or the exact measurements of the temple, or the records of how much grain the royal court consumed, those aren't legends. Those are drawn from authentic royal court records and temple archives.
And then you have the third layer, which is the glue holding it all together, the Deuteronomistic framing.
Let's explain this in a way that makes sense, because Deuteronomistic history sounds like a terrifying graduate school exam topic.
It does sound intimidating.
Think of the Deuteronomistic historians like a team of modern political aides trying to write the definitive biography of a deceased, highly controversial president, but they are writing it years later after the president's political party has suffered a catastrophic collapse.
That's a great way to look at it.
Right. They are taking all the raw data, the memos, the speeches, the scandals, and they are adding editorial commentary to make it fit a specific theological worldview. Their entire worldview is based on the book of Deuteronomy. If you obey the covenant, you prosper. If you break the covenant, you are destroyed.
That is a perfect analogy. Martin Oth, the scholar who first really codified the theory of the Deuteronomistic History, or the DTRH, pointed out that for these editors, Solomon initially represents the absolute theological peak of Israel's history.
Because he builds the temple.
Yes. He temporarily fulfills the two central driving demands of their worldview. First, Deuteronomy 12 demands a single centralized place of worship. Solomon builds the temple. Second, 2 Samuel 7 contains God's promise of an enduring Davidic dynasty. Solomon represents the first successful generational transfer of that power.
Right.
So chapters 1 through 10 are the golden age. Everything the editors value is coming to fruition.
But the golden age doesn't last, which is why Frank Moore Cross's two-edition hypothesis is so illuminating. Cross argued that the main edition of this historical narrative wasn't written during Solomon's time, but hundreds of years later, during the reign of King Josiah in the late 7th century BCE.
And this is where the mechanism of ancient editing becomes fascinating. For the Josianic editors, Solomon is not just a historical figure. He is a deliberate theological foil for their current king, Josiah.
A foil. That makes so much sense.
They construct the narrative to highlight the contrast. Solomon built the temple, yes, but then he built high places for foreign gods on the surrounding hills. Josiah, centuries later, purified the temple and violently tore those high places down.
So Josiah is the anti-Solomon?
In many ways, yes. Solomon multiplied foreign wives who turned his heart away. Josiah aggressively enforced the Deuteronomic law against foreign entanglements. The history of Solomon is written specifically to validate the aggressive, puritanical reforms of King Josiah.
And yet, they didn't completely scrub the historical record to make it perfectly fit their agenda. I love pointing out a tiny, easily missed detail in chapter 4. There's this administrative list of Solomon's cabinet. Verse 4 casually lists Abiathar as a priest.
Oh, I love this part.
Right. But wait, didn't we just read in chapter 2 that Solomon fired Abiathar and banished him to Anathoth?
Yes, he did.
So why is he still listed in the cabinet in chapter 4? A casual reader might think it's a mistake, but critical scholars view this as absolute gold.
It is gold.
It is evidence of an authentic, unedited archival document. The Josianic editors had this ancient list of officials from Solomon's early reign, and they preserved it exactly as they found it, even though it created a slight chronological contradiction with the narrative they just told. It proves they were working with real ancient sources and had a level of respect for those texts.
Gary Knoppers adds another crucial layer to this understanding, which he calls Zion theology.
Zion theology, what's that?
Well, for these later editors, watching their nation crumble under Assyrian and Babylonian threats, they needed a theological anchor. Knoppers points out that they viewed God's election of Jerusalem, and specifically the Temple Mount, as unconditional.
Okay.
The covenant with the Davidic kings might be conditional. If they sin, they are punished. But the geographic selection of Zion is permanent. It persists even through the catastrophic failures of individual kings like Solomon. The temple is worth Josiah saving, because God's choice of that space cannot be undone by human stupidity.
Which brings us back into the narrative itself, right after the bloodbath of chapter 2. Solomon has secured the throne, but he needs divine validation. How does a king with so much blood on his hands convince his people and himself that he is a righteous ruler?
Right, he needs a mandate.
He needs a mandate. And that leads us directly to the famous dream at Gibeon in chapter 3.
Now, why Gibeon? Because at this point, the Ark of the Covenant is in a tent in Jerusalem, but the massive bronze sacrificial altar constructed by Moses in the wilderness is located at the high place in Gibeon. Solomon goes there to offer a massive sacrifice, 1,000 burnt offerings.
That's a huge logistical undertaking.
It is a display of staggering wealth and devotion.
And the dream he has that night fits a very specific, recognizable ancient Near Eastern genre. When we look at extra-biblical texts, like the records of the Sumerian ruler Gudea of Lagash or the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, we see a pattern. Kings receive divine dreams that commission them for major building projects and grant them the wisdom to execute them. The biblical authors are framing Solomon in a political and theological grammar that the ancient world would instantly respect.
In the dream, God issues a blank check. Ask what I shall give you. And Solomon's response is brilliant. He doesn't ask for wealth or the death of his enemies or a long life. He asks for a lev shumea.
Lev shumea.
This is typically translated in English as an understanding mind, but literally in Hebrew it means a listening heart.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that, because the ancient Israelite understanding of the body is so different from ours. To us, the heart is the center of emotion, and the brain is the center of logic. But in ancient Israelite psychology, the heart, the lev, is the command center.
Right.
It is the seat of the will, of intellectual perception, and of moral reasoning. And shemea, hearing, implies active obedience. So when Solomon asks for a listening heart, he's not asking for empathy or emotional intelligence.
No, not at all.
He is asking for the sharp, penetrating moral perception to see reality exactly as it is, and the will to govern accordingly. He wants to be able to hear the underlying truth beneath the noise of human deception.
And God immediately puts that Lev Shomea to the test with one of the most famous stories in all of literature. The two mothers and the one living baby. Two prostitutes live in the same house. One baby dies in the night, the other lives. Both women stand before the king claiming the living child is theirs. It's the ultimate judicial nightmare. There are no witnesses, no DNA testing, just a desperate he said, she said.
Solomon listens and then calls for a sword. He orders the living child to be cut in half, with one half given to each woman.
Right.
The true mother, overwhelmed by compassion, begs him to give the child to the other woman so it will live. The false mother, consumed by spite, agrees to the division. Solomon immediately identifies the true mother and returns her child. Now, I have to push back on this story, because as famous as it has always terrified me. What if the false mother hadn't spoken up? What if both women had just stared at him in horrified silence? Was Solomon just bluffing? Because if he wasn't, he was about to murder an infant. It seems like a psychopathic gamble with a human life.
It's a totally valid reaction, but we have to read this through the lens of ancient literary genres. Historians view this narrative as a classic wisdom tale. We actually find very similar stories in ancient Sanskrit and Chinese literature.
Oh, really?
Yes. Its primary function in the text is not to be a literal historical court transcript. Its function is to serve as a credential. It proves to the reader that Solomon possesses the Lev Shomea. It demonstrates his ability to cut past the surface evidence and expose the profound human reality underneath.
So it's more about his perception.
Right. It doesn't matter if he was bluffing or not. The genre requires the wise king to use a creative, shocking test to force the truth to the surface. It's an archetype of perfect justice.
And his wisdom extends far beyond the courtroom. Chapter 4 gives us a breathtaking summary of his intellectual capacity. It says he spoke 3,000 proverbs, but more importantly, it details his cosmological wisdom. He understands the mechanics of nature. He can speak of trees, from the massive cedar of Lebanon down to the tiny hyssop growing out of the wall. He knows the beasts, the birds, the reptiles, and the fish.
Why does the text care that he knows about reptiles and plants?
That's a great question.
Because in the ancient mind, understanding the encyclopedic order of nature proves that you understand the architecture of the created cosmos. God ordered the world, and Solomon can read that order. And if you understand how the cosmos is built, you are the exact right king to build a microcosm of that universe on Earth. You are qualified to build a temple.
Which brings us to the absolute theological center of 1 Kings. The temple as a 3D cosmogram and a reconstruction of Eden. But before we get into the theology, we need to address the archaeology, or rather, the frustrating lack of it.
Right. It's the elephant in the room for biblical archaeologists. There are no direct archaeological remains of Solomon's temple. None.
None at all.
The Temple Mount has been repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt by the Babylonians, by the returnees from exile, and most massively by Herod the Great. Add to that the current, highly volatile political realities of the site, which make modern excavation completely impossible.
So scholars are deeply divided. You have maximalists like the late Eilat Mazar, who argue that the massive 10th century stone walls excavated south of the Temple Mount reflect Solomon's administrative expansion.
Yes.
Then you have minimalists who argue that the biblical description of this massive gold-plated structure is entirely anachronistic, that later authors were projecting an idealized, much later Iron Age structure back into the legendary past.
But regardless of the physical footprint in the 10th century BCE, the theological blueprint described in the text is what we really need to focus on. G.K. Beale has done incredible work framing the temple as a 3D cosmogram, a physical architectural model of the universe.
Let's break down the mechanics of that model. It's a three-part structure. You start in the outer courtyard. In Beale's framework, the courtyard represents the inhabited earth, the domain of humanity, the physical world we live in.
Okay.
As you move inside to the first room, the holy place, you enter a space that represents the visible heavens. This explains the specific furnishings. The menorah, the massive 7-branch lampstand, isn't just for light. It represents the heavenly luminaries, the sun, the moon, and the 5 visible planets.
And then you pass through the veil into the innermost room, the Holy of Holies. This room is a perfect cube, 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet, enveloped in total darkness. It represents the invisible, transcendent, unapproachable throne room of God. entirely removed from the visible cosmos.
But Beale's cosmogram is just one layer. Layered directly on top of that is the work of scholar Gordon Wenham, who argues that the temple is explicitly designed to be a sensory reconstruction of the Garden of Eden.
This is such a cool concept.
Isn't it? Imagine the experience of a priest walking into the holy place. Every single wall is paneled in highly fragrant cedar from Lebanon. The cedar is intricately carved with gourds, open flowers, and palm trees. The floor is overlaid with pure gold. When you step into this room, surrounded by botanical carvings and the heavy, intoxicating smell of cedar, you are stepping backward in time. You are re-entering the primordial garden before the fall.
And the menorah fits perfectly into this Edenic imagery as well. It's described as having a central shaft with branches coming out of it, decorated with almond blossoms. It is literally shaped like a tree. It is the tree of life, burning with divine light, standing right there in the garden room.
Jon Levenson calls this concept the axis mundi, the cosmic center. The temple is the anchor holding the fractured world together. It is the single geographical point where heaven and earth intersect. But the symbolism gets even more intense when you look at the boundary markers, specifically the cherubim. Inside the Holy of Holies, Solomon places two massive cherubim carved from olive wood and overlaid with gold. Now, we need to completely erase the Renaissance image of cherubim from our minds. These are not chubby, naked babies playing harps on clouds.
Far from it. In ancient Near Eastern iconography, cherubim are terrifying hybrid creatures. They usually have the body of a lion or a bull, the wings of an eagle, and a human face. They are composite beasts representing all domains of the animal kingdom.
They sound intimidating.
They are. Solomon's cherubim are massive, 15 feet tall, with wingspans that stretch 15 feet across, so that their wings touch in the center of the room and reach the outer walls. They form the throne seat of the invisible God.
We see this exact imagery in Ezekiel chapters 1 and 10, where cherubim are the living, mechanical boundary guardians of God's mobile throne chariot. But the Eden connection is what blows my mind. In Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve rebel and are expelled from the Garden of Eden, what does God place at the eastern entrance to guard the way back to the tree of life?
He places cherubim and a flaming sword.
Exactly. So once a year, on Yom Kippur, when the Israelite high priest approaches the veil to enter the Holy of Holies, he is literally approaching the guarded gate of Eden. He is facing the cherubim. But here is the beautiful theological mechanism in the temple. Unlike the physical Garden of Eden, there is a mediated way back in.
Wow.
Through the structure of the covenant, through the sacred clothing of the priesthood, and through the atoning blood of the sacrifice, the high priest can safely pass the terrifying guardians and enter the presence of God on behalf of humanity. The exile of Eden is temporarily reversed.
And the boundaries of this sacred space are marked outside as well. Before you even enter the building, you pass between Jachin and Boaz, two massive 35-foot bronze pillars.
Yeah.
They don't hold up the roof. They're entirely freestanding.
So what do?
They function as cosmic sentinels, marking the exact threshold where profane everyday space ends and sacred hyperreal space begins.
And then there is my favorite furnishing in the entire complex, the molten sea, or the yam. This is a massive bronze basin in the courtyard, 15 feet across, resting on the backs of 12 bronze oxen. It held around 10,000 gallons of water.
That's huge.
Yeah. Practically, it was used for the priests to ritually wash themselves, but the theology of it is wild. The Hebrew word used, yam, literally translates to sea. And in the ancient Near East, the sea is not just water, it is a malevolent force. It represents primordial, terrifying, unchecked chaos.
To understand how radical this is, look at Israel's neighbors. In Canaanite mythology, the storm god Beale has to engage in a violent, bloody battle to the death with the sea god, who is literally named Yam. In Babylonian myth, the champion god Marduk slaughters the chaotic ocean monster Tiamat to create the world. The gods are constantly fighting the water to keep the universe from collapsing.
Right.
But Israel completely demythologizes this concept. In the Genesis creation account, there is no battle. Yahweh just speaks, and the chaotic waters part.
And that theological supremacy is physically built into the temple courtyard. Why put a symbol of terrifying chaos right where people are worshiping? It's like this, the chaos of the world, the suffering, the unpredictability, the darkness is not eradicated. It still exists, but it is captured in bronze. Domesticated, exactly.
Yeah.
The terrifying primordial ocean that terrified ancient sailors is turned into a stationary liturgical bathtub. It rests completely obedient on the backs of 12 oxen facing the four corners of the earth. The chaos is repurposed as a mechanism for purification. It's a 10,000-gallon statement of absolute divine sovereignty. God doesn't fight the chaos. He uses it to wash his priests.
For Latter-day Saint listeners, this deep dive into temple theology is not just an academic exercise in ancient history. It is a living, breathing theological grammar. The architecture of the ancient world maps directly onto modern practice. The most obvious visible connection is the baptismal font found in modern LDS temples.
Oh yeah, the oxen.
Exactly. It explicitly quotes Solomon's molten sea. It is the large basin resting on 12 oxen. It visually communicates that the passage through water, the taming of chaos, and the ritual purification of the individual is a continuous process spanning across dispensations.
LDS scholars like William Hamblin and David Rolfe Seeley have spent careers tracing these connections, arguing that modern LDS temple practice is a restoration of First Temple theology. But to really get into the weeds here, we have to talk about Margaret Barker. She's an Oxford scholar and a Methodist minister, not a Latter-day Saint, but her work has hit LDS scholarship like a thunderbolt over the last few decades.
Barker's central thesis is incredibly provocative. She argues that King Josiah's reforms in the 7th century, the exact same puritanical reforms that the Deuteronomistic editors praised actually suppressed and violently destroyed the most vital mystical elements of the original First Temple theology.
Let's explain how she thinks that happened. Barker argues that before Josiah scrubbed the religion, the ancient Israelite temple involved a much richer, more complex theology. It included the veneration of wisdom as a feminine divine figure often associated with the tree of life.
Right.
It included elaborate rituals of royal anointing and sacred clothing that transformed the king into an adopted son of God. It involved a profound mystical experience where the high priest entered the Holy of Holies and emerged transformed, representing the Lord to the people. She argues that early Christianity, and LDS scholars would add, the restored gospel preserves these older, suppressed mystical truths, rather than the stripped-down, purely legalistic Judaism that emerged after Josiah and during the Second Temple period.
Now, it's important to note that Barker's methodology is heavily debated in mainstream critical scholarship. Many view her reading of later Enochic literature back into the First Temple period as highly speculative. But for LDS scholars like Kevin Christensen, the resonances are just too profound to ignore.
Think about the progression in an LDS temple endowment. It perfectly mirrors the physical movement of the biblical priests. You move from an outer earthly space progressively inward toward a celestial space, learning the order of the cosmos along the way.
Exactly.
It involves ritual clothing that marks a transition in sacred status, directly echoing the garments of Aaron. It relies entirely on the concept of mediators to pass through boundaries. And most fundamentally, the entire LDS endowment is a ritual drama of Eden restored. Participants are taught how to move past the angelic sentinels, through the veil, and back into the presence of God. The physical veil of the ancient temple in Jerusalem is the very theological mechanism represented in modern LDS worship.
There's also a fascinating administrative detail in the construction of the temple that speaks volumes. Solomon hires a master craftsman named Hiram of Tyre to cast all these intricate bronze furnishings, the pillars, the oxen, the molten sea.
Oh, Hiram.
Yes, Hiram is half Israelite and half Phoenician. He uses Phoenician architectural models, Tyrian techniques, and imported materials to build Yahweh's house.
I love that detail. It demonstrates that the skills, the artistry, and the resources required to build God's house don't always have to come from inside the bubble of the covenant community. God happily consecrates the secular genius of the world for his sacred purposes. Truth and beauty are recognized wherever they are found.
So we have this magnificent, cosmologically perfect structure. The nation is wealthy, secure, and at peace. It is the zenith of the history. And then we turn the page to chapter 11, and the entire edifice collapses under its own weight.
We hit the tragedy, Solomon's apostasy. So what does this all mean? To understand how completely Solomon fails, we have to look at the mechanism of the law of the king found in Deuteronomy 17. The Deuteronomistic editors use this law as the rubric to grade Solomon, and he scores a 0.
A flat 0.
The law explicitly states that the king shall not multiply horses from Egypt because relying on foreign cavalry leads to trusting military might over God. What does Solomon do? He builds a massive chariot army and imports thousands of horses from Egypt.
The law says the king shall not greatly multiply silver and gold for himself because exorbitant wealth leads to the oppression of the people. What does Solomon do? His wealth becomes legendary. He makes silver as common as stones in Jerusalem. But how does he get that wealth? Through forced labor.
Right.
He implements oppressive taxation and corvée labor, essentially drafting Israelites to work in his quarries and forests, treating his own people like Pharaoh treated them in Egypt.
And then the final law. He shall not multiply wives, lest his heart turn away. Solomon takes 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now let's explain the how of this, because he isn't just a uniquely prolific, romantic...
Right, these are diplomatic marriages.
Yeah.
In the ancient Near East, you sealed a peace treaty or a trade agreement by marrying a daughter of the foreign king. By taking 1,000 women into his harem, Solomon is securing 1,000 political and economic alliances. He's trying to build a perfectly secure empire based on human statecraft. But with foreign princesses come foreign entourages, foreign priests, and foreign gods.
And this is where the slow fade is so critical to understand. The mechanism of his apostasy wasn't an overnight crisis of faith. The Hebrew verb used to describe his heart turning away is in the continuous imperfect tense. It implies an ongoing, gradual process, a slow, daily attrition.
He didn't wake up one morning and decide he hated Yahweh. It started with a small compromise here for political expediency, a diplomatic accommodation there to keep an Egyptian princess or a Moabite queen happy. Of course, you can have a small shrine to your god. It's just diplomacy.
Yeah, just trying to keep the peace.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Over decades, this syncretism compounded. He never explicitly stopped worshiping Yahweh. He just added to him. He became religiously polyglot.
And the physical result is horrifying. He builds high places for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and Molech, the god of Ammon, right on the Mount of Olives, the very mountain that overlooks the temple he built for Yahweh. The Lev Shemaiah, the listening heart that could perceive profound moral truth, became deafened by the noise of 1,000 political compromises.
The consequences are immediate and devastating. God raises up adversaries against him. But the fatal blow comes from within. The prophet Ahijah finds Jeroboam, a capable young official who had been in charge of Solomon's forced labor gangs. Ahijah takes a brand new garment, tears it violently into 12 pieces, and hands 10 of them to Jeroboam. He prophesies that because of Solomon's idolatry, God will tear the kingdom away.
The economic weight of Solomon's building projects had crushed the northern tribes, and now the religious apostasy provides the divine spark for rebellion. The kingdom is violently split. 10 tribes will follow Jeroboam to the north, creating the kingdom of Israel. Only one tribe, Judah, along with the remnants of Benjamin, will remain for Solomon's arrogant son, Rehoboam, in the south, preserving a tiny remnant for David's sake. The golden age doesn't just end of him, it shatters into pieces that will never be put back together.
Which brings us to a moment where we need to let the dust settle. We've spent a lot of time analyzing the geopolitical mechanisms, the architectural symbolism, and the textual history of these chapters.
A lot of ground covered, yeah.
But we want to soften our focus as we conclude. We are going to step back from the critical analysis and lean into the devotional reality of what this space meant. We're looking at the Come Follow Me lesson titled, Hear Thou in Heaven Their Prayer, which centers entirely on Solomon's dedicatory prayer in 1 Kings 8.
When I read that prayer, what strikes me most deeply is its startling, almost jarring honesty. Solomon has just finished building a flawless, gold-covered architectural masterpiece. It is the most beautiful, expensive building on earth. But when he stands before the altar to dedicate it, he doesn't pray for a perfect people.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't ask God to bless a flawless congregation. He explicitly assumes that they will fail. He says to God, if they sin against thee, for there is no man that sinneth not. He knows human nature. He is building a structure of mercy. The temple, for all its gold and cedar, is not a trophy for the triumphant. It is a beacon for the broken.
The entire architecture of the prayer is structured around catastrophe. He outlines scenarios of defeat in battle, devastating drought, crushing famine, and eventually total exile into a foreign land. And the recurring mechanism, the pivot point in every single one of those disasters, is the Hebrew word shav. It means to return or to repent.
And shav is such a physical concept, isn't it?
It is entirely physical. It isn't just about feeling sorry. It is about reorientation. Solomon asks that when the people's failures have landed them in a foreign land, whether physically in exile or spiritually in the dark, they will just turn their faces back toward this house and reorient their lives toward God, that God will hear them from heaven and forgive.
That's beautiful.
Repentance isn't about achieving a state of flawless moral perfection. It's about checking your compass and turning back toward the center.
And there is a beautiful, expansive universalism in this prayer that is quite rare in ancient texts. Solomon specifically carves out space in his petition for the foreigner. He asks that when a stranger who is not of Israel comes from a far country because they have heard of God's name and they pray toward this house, that God will hear them and answer.
Right.
This directly connects to the deepest Latter-day Saint understanding of what temple work actually is. The God who dwells in this house is not a tribal deity whose mercy is restricted to a specific ZIP code or a specific bloodline. The covenant is elastic, it extends across time, it reaches across family lines, and it encompasses all of humanity. The doors of mercy are explicitly open to the entire human family.
To bring this entire deep dive full circle, we must look at the literal foundation of the temple itself. Where is this massive structure built? It is built on Mount Moriah, specifically on the site of Araunah's threshing floor.
Right where we ended our last conversation in 2 Samuel.
Exactly. The temple is built on the exact geographic coordinate where David saw the destroying angel. It is the precise spot where the devastating plague of his own making finally stopped, where the sword of judgment was sheathed. I think that is the most profound theological point in the entire architectural plan.
I couldn't agree more.
The temple is not built on a foundation of human achievement or perfection. It is built on the exact site of divine mercy interceding in human catastrophe. The suffering of the people, the plague, the death, it wasn't ignored or papered over. It was absorbed into the very foundation of the temple's meaning. God relented here once when humanity was at its worst, and the temple stands as a permanent stone promise that he can be trusted to relent here again.
That is incredibly powerful. The architecture of the cosmos, the recreation of Eden, sits squarely on the floor of human suffering and divine forgiveness.
It really is a profound image.
As we wrap up this conversation, I want to leave you with a provocative final thought, something to mull over on your own as you close out this section of 1 Kings. We saw how Solomon began his reign. He asked God for a lev shomeah, a listening heart, a heart capable of profound moral perception. And God miraculously, definitively granted it to him. He was the wisest man alive. Yet decades later, the text bluntly tells us that his heart was turned away by competing loyalties, political pragmatism, and slow compromises.
Yeah.
So here's the question. What does it take to maintain a listening heart over the slow, daily, grinding attrition of a lifetime, rather than just possessing it in a single early moment of brilliant divine encounter? Wisdom isn't a permanent installation. It requires daily maintenance.
It's the vital question for anyone trying to navigate the complex realities of faith over the span of a whole life.
Thank you so much for joining us in this deep dive. Next time, we will be stepping into the wreckage of Solomon's decisions. We'll be moving into the chaotic, violent era of the divided monarchy, exploring the wild ministries of Elijah and Elisha, and witnessing the devastating consequences of a kingdom fractured by its own compromises. We'll see you then.